Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to week 11 of SDSU's Extension's Crop Hour webinar series. This week has been dedicated to water, weather, and climate. I'm Dave Kringen, Extension Water Resources Field Specialist, and will be your moderator this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to your questions at the end of each presentation. And for those of you looking for continuing education credits, we'll be displaying a QR code at the end of each presentation as well. There will also be a short poll at the end of each presentation with just a couple of questions on it, and I encourage you to fill it out and to let our speakers know how they're doing. And there'll also be a longer survey sent to your email at the end of the week. Probably today. I guess it is the end of the week, so let's look for that as well. And with that, today we're talking about all things weather. And our first speaker is Laura Edwards, SDSU Extension State Climatologist based out of the Aberdeen Regional Center. And Laura will be talking about 2021 weather outlook and trends to watch. And with that, Laura, take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Dave. So I don't know if any of you attended Soy 100 earlier this week, where I also talked about a climate outlook there. But since then, a little bit has changed. And so just yesterday, NOAA Climate Prediction Center released their climate outlooks for April and for the seasonal outlooks as well, which are 3 months, April through June and beyond. They do 3-month periods out for about a year. So we'll give you hopefully a better look at what our spring and summer are going to look like this season, what that might mean for crop production here in South Dakota. And I don't know if I'm going to make a whole lot of friends here today, but we'll see what the drought situation is going to be like as well as we look ahead. And then, as Dave mentioned, Kevin Lau from the River Forecast Center will also give us some insight into the flood outlook for the season too. So here we go. This picture is obviously not a current picture. That's just a reminder of just less than 2 years ago. That was summer 2019. That's the corn and soybean field right where we live, northeast of Aberdeen, and it doesn't look anything like that right now, obviously. But just a reminder how quick things can change here in the plains and in South Dakota. We're kind of the land of extremes up here, and things can change quickly in a hurry, both wet and dry. So I'm going to start kind of looking backwards in time, kind of to set us up to where we are today, looking at recent past conditions to current. Obviously, drought is one of the things we're talking about most right now, and then I'll look into the outlooks, into the projections for the rest of March and into the summer season. First, starting looking at temperature first. This is the departure from average temperature, how different we've been so far. This is for the calendar year, so since January, the first 2.5 months of the year so far. You see the north central, northeastern part of the state really has been warmer than average for the last couple months. Slightly so in the southeast, where you see more of the lighter oranges. And then out in the Black Hills and that far west, they have been a bit cooler than average for most of those areas. So kind of a mixed bag when we look at the year to date overall. But if we look at winter, the last 3 months of December, January, and February, we ended up the 21st warmest winter since 1895. So a lot of us remember that kind of 2-week cold period in February. Certainly it was cold, but overall December was very warm. January is very warm. So we actually, overall, if you look at the winter overall, we had actually a pretty warm winter. You know, we've had very little snow cover most of the season. Whatever did come melted away pretty quickly. But you can also see on this graph as well, this is winter temperatures for South Dakota all the way back 1895 to 2021, where we just ended here. that blue line there is showing us the trend, and on the trend, in the long-term trend, we do see warmer winters more often than not. And you can see just since, the 1980s, we've seen most of our 20 warmest winters have occurred in the last, 30 years or so, with the exception of, that period in about 1930 or so. You already see that big spike there, but in general, we are seeing more warmer winters, and I think that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking long-term crop production. Thinking of overwintering of pests, trying to retain moisture over that winter season. If we don't have snow cover or warmer winters that melt our snow cover more easily. And it's not just here that we're seeing warmer temperatures. We see warmer temperatures across a lot of the northern states in the winter. That's the bottom left map there. This is a long-term trend looking over 115 years from the early 1900s to about 2015. On an annual basis, we are warming, but we don't see as much here in South Dakota in the summer. Really, it's more concentrated in the winter season. So what we've seen this last year is consistent with our long-term trend. Precipitation wise, this is percent of normal precipitation. So the cool colors, greens, blues, purples, are wetter than average. Reds, oranges are drier than average. So you can see across the northern tier, since January 1st, since the beginning of the year, we've been drier than average. Some areas, that north central, less than 5% of average, less than 25% of average for the season, or less 2.5 months. And granted, the winter is our dry season in general, but really that doesn't help since we carried over such a dry condition from the fall season. We didn't get the soil recharge from the fall rains that we often do. So it's kind of accumulating the issues here of a drought situation. Down in the south, the last few days, the last 5 days, has really changed the picture in the south and the southeast. They did not look quite that purple, quite that rosy a few days ago. So really the snow and precipitation that we got on the southern tier of the state over the last week or so has really kind of bumped up the numbers and made it look a little better down there. And I'll show you how that's reflected in the drought situation in a minute. Looking at winter precipitation, again, 1895 to current, this does not include March. This is just December, January, and February. But again, that season, 21st driest since 1895. And the driest winter we've had in about 15 years, since 2005. And some of you may remember we had a multi-year drought there in the early 2000s, say 02 to 06, more or less. So again, we haven't seen many dry winters lately. So it's a little bit change of pace here, warm plus dry in our winter season. And looking at the trend here, we don't see a big trend of precipitation in the wintertime. But you can see, towards the right side of the graph, we've had more wet years than dry years, more dots above that gray line than below. So we do, but that we do see a lot of variability. And again, wintertime, 3 inches of precipitation is or rather 1.5 inches or so is the average statewide anyway. Looking at the long-term trends, and is this kind of normal? Is this something we're going to expect more of? Maybe, maybe not. On an annual basis, South Dakota is getting wetter faster than almost anywhere else in the country. If you look at that top map there, there's that darker green bullseye right over South Dakota. That's 15% on the trend and long-term trend over 115 years. But if you break it down by season, it really gives a different picture. And in the winter there, on the left side, you kind of a mixed bag. Some parts of the state are getting drier, some are getting wetter in the winter season. So, what we saw just this last winter, isn't inconsistent, I'd say, with a long-term trend. What's going to be different, though, I think the spring is spring and fall is where we see those biggest upward trends in precipitation, and this spring is not looking real promising. I think a lot of our practices have become accustomed to wetter springs. Certainly we've seen a lot of flooding here over the last 20 years, 15, 20 years. So I think, again, thinking long-term and being able to adjust and be a little resilient to these seasons like now where we see these dry seasons starting out is something to consider in the long run. Looking over the last 6 months, I wanted to show this map, percent of normal precipitation for the last 6 months, because it sets up our soil moisture situation and what we're heading into spring here. So, the last week aside, it's actually been very dry over the last 6 months. And, all those reds are 70% or less of precipitation. You see in the north central, northwest, areas that have struggled even more. So certainly that is reflecting in our soil moisture, and this is looking at our South Dakota Mesonet. Just this morning, I pulled this, or last night maybe, where we call this the poker chip map, where each chip at a stack, the stack is at where the station is, each chip reflects a sensor from 2 to 40 inches in depth. Ones that are grayed out, those levels that are gray are frozen at 32 degrees or colder, so we're not showing the moisture at those sensors. But in the next slide, I'll show you what we looked like a year ago this time, and you'll see that a lot of the areas have reduced soil moisture from last year. And remember, last year, 2020, we carried over this enormous reserve of water from 2019, which was record wet over almost all the states. So, we kind of had that savings account in the soil a year ago that really carried us through the growing season. And even though we had quite a bit of dry conditions, this year we don't have that savings account to draw from, and there's really not a lot of buffer, I'd say, in the system as far as soil moisture goes, to carry us through. So we're going to be really critical, leaning on rainfall this spring and summer to get us through this growing season. So anyway, here we go. The legend is at the bottom of what each color means. Just recognize darker blue is wetter. As you get to yellow oranges, that's drier. So you can look at your favorite station here and at the different depths. And I'll show the next slide here, which is 2020. So this is what we looked like a year ago at the end of March. Almost everywhere across the board got drier, some by half, some by 20 to 30%. But really, we are carrying a fair bit of less moisture in the soils as we did a year ago. And I encourage you to check that out too. If you want to visit the Mesonet website, it's updated every day. Real-time data is every 5 minutes, and the soil moisture is up there too. If we're going to look a little more broadly, not every weather station network has a poker chip map, so I have to rely on some other things to fill in the blank here. So this is the Climate Prediction Center's soil moisture anomaly map. So anomaly is how different they are from average for this time of year. Again, a lot different picture today than it was, say, 5-7 days ago, where all that moisture kind of dumped right over Nebraska and up into southern South Dakota. But still we see, abnormally dry conditions, at least in drought conditions in the north, northeast, and up into North Dakota. A lot of the areas around us to the northwest and east, kind of around us, are on dry conditions right now, although the situation has improved in the south. So we're not the only ones here looking at drought. This is the Drought Monitor that was updated yesterday morning, and it's updated every Thursday morning all year round, not just during the growing season. So You can see about almost 80% of the state right now is in some level of drought, and that's D1 or worse, not D0, but D1 or worse, about 78%, I believe, right now. So that's about a 14 percentage point reduction from the week prior, mostly in that southern part of the state. And again, I'm going to show you now some maps of drought areas over different crops. And for the drought areas, we're going to look at D1 or worse and how they overlay with different production areas for some different crops. So I'll show you that. This is from USDA. The first one we're going to look at is soybeans areas in drought. So to read these, the dark green areas are the major crop growing areas. The light green are the minor crop growing areas. This is for soybeans. And then the red hatched area is anything on the drought monitor that was D1 or worse. So you can see where that overlays with the production area. Really up here, it's the northern western soybean growing area that's really in any level of drought right now. A couple isolated areas over Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. But really it's just us up here. So when you think about marketing and other things related to production and selling your product, just something to keep in mind here as we start the growing season. Corn areas in drought, very similar, very similar growing area. Again, it's the northern and western part of the Corn Belt that's really more in drought than anywhere else. Sunflower area. So I don't know how many of you do sunflowers. I know we had a week here dedicated to sunflowers, but nearly everywhere that's a major sunflower growing area is in drought of some level, and especially here in the Dakotas. Just last week is when North Dakota, or just yesterday rather, is when North Dakota got that D3 extreme drought designation up in their north central part of the state. So they're actually trending worse, at least of late. So again, something to keep in mind as we start off this growing season. Winter wheat, up here in South Dakota, it's more considered a minor crop growing area. There are some pockets here that of winter wheat areas that are in some level of drought, especially here out in the west, northwest. But again, I think they've been struggling with more moisture in Nebraska right now than drought conditions. So it doesn't really tell the wet side of the story. But I know that winter wheat too, it kind of had a tough fall with the dry fall season, and we're starting off a little dry now in the spring. So hopefully again, we can at least get some timely rains to make up some moisture for that crop to help get it going. So I've talked a lot about this change. So I want to transition winter wheat to look at this drought monitor again for South Dakota. And I have on the left the map from September 1st, and then the map on the right is the map from yesterday. And I said early on, in the winter season is climatologically our driest season, but it was so warm, and the fall was so warm and dry, rather dry, that we actually saw some significant expansion of drought area and drought severity over what's typically a quiet season. And again, it's looking at some of these impacts that have been ramping up, and part of it is dried out vegetation, maybe reduced snow cover to protect that winter wheat crop. We haven't been able to replenish much in soil moisture, or have snow on the ground that will melt and refill, say, our stock ponds and livestock water sources and surface water kinds of things. Wildland fire risk has increased over the winter season. So there's been a lot of things going on in the winter where we often think it's pretty quiet. Sure, from a cropping perspective, it probably is maybe the best time to have a drought if there ever is a good time. But that's not to say that drought didn't change over that season. Kind of changing tracks here. Looking at frost depth, this is another question I get this time of year. You know, what's the frost look like? And this is looking at the Mesonet data again on all those soil sensors down to 40 inches deep or so. And much of the central and southern part of the state is already thawed out through the profile. You know, a couple weeks ago, as we saw air temperatures like in the 70s, things were warming up real quick. And so we're seeing this now, you know, as we see some cooler nights and warmer days, you might see the shallow layers, you know, get some frost here and there, up and down. But in general, a lot of those areas are thawed. And again, that was a benefit when we saw that precipitation. And now we're watching the snow melt in the south. It's really able to infiltrate and really kind of help out our shallow soil situation, at least, instead of running off. So still seeing some frost across the north. But again, I think it'll come up pretty quick if we get any substantial long-term warm period. Even this weekend, we're going to see some highs in the 60s up here. So we also look at thaw depth. So sometimes, some years, you know, the whole profile will thaw out kind of all at once and frost will go away. Sometimes frost comes up from the bottom and also comes down from the top. So this is looking at thaw depth from the top, and the frost depth is looking at the bottom. So sometimes you get kind of this layer in between. And so that's what this is looking at. So we see over Webster, Lemon, we see some shallow thaw layer at the top of the soil profile, where we still have some frost down below, however. All right, so looking ahead towards the climate outlook, I know I'm talking pretty fast, but I want to get through some of the stuff here. So we've got La Nina to talk about. As I look at the outlooks here, I'll kind of start the short term, the next week or so, and then kind of step out longer term. First of all, this is looking at La Nina projections and predictions, and there are a lot of models. All those colors on the side, all those lines reflect a model of some type and what they're predicting for El Nino or La Nina. So looking at the graph here, if you look on the left, negative 0.5. Let's see if I can do this laser pointer. Yep. So negative 0.5 here, anything negative 0.5 or below is considered La Nina conditions if it stays there for a while. So that's where we started off down here, where it says observed January. We started off at about -1, and this is looking at sea surface temperature in the Pacific Ocean. So certainly La Nina conditions. You can see a lot of models are showing some warming there, maybe going up above 0.5 up above -0.5 up into what we call neutral. To be El Nino, you'd have to be above +0.5. So almost none of the models, only a very few of them are showing anything going towards La Nina or El Nino. At the bottom here are the abbreviations for the months. So you start with January, February, March, April, May, and so on up until the winter, October, November, December. So you see, you know, a lot of the models are kind of going towards neutral, but maybe some are going back towards La Nina, going back colder. So, you know, people are asking me a lot, when is La Nina going to go away? Is that going to be a factor? You know, what's coming up? And again, bottom line here is a fair bit of uncertainty as to what La Nina is going to do. And so what's our impact either way? If we continue to hold in La Nina conditions, what does that mean for us? Well, here's what it looks like looking at La Nina conditions and corn yield. I don't have this for any of the crops, just for corn yield. And here in South Dakota, anything green, slightly above average yield. In La Nina years, anything in the beige brown colors, slightly below average yield for corn during La Nina years. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Again, these numbers are so small. You know, really the lightest colors of browns and greens that it's kind of hard to differentiate that from like the variability that we see anyway. So, you know, might not tell us a whole lot here. La Nina and corn yield, you know, it looks like in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, you see more often than not reductions in yield with La Nina years. So looking at the forecast and outlook, this is total 7-day precipitation forecast. So the total moisture, rainfall expected in the next 7 days. This is from NOAA. You see a dry spot, clear white there over the southwest, south central part of the state. So not great news, but again, that area is the area that benefited from some rains in the last week. So maybe they're not as starved for moisture there. But southeast does look like you might catch some chances of precipitation here over the next week. Do have a little, you know, a few chances, a little active pattern for a little while here setting up. So cross fingers that we can continue kind of our trend of some improvement here in the next week or so. But as we look beyond that, this is about a week from now. Temperatures look like they're going to start to lean more on the cooler side, you know, starting later next week. And on the right there, also heading into a drier pattern. So if we don't see some moisture here in the next, you know, 5 days or so, 5 to 7 days, could be pretty quiet for a while as we get into that late March period. Looking a step ahead here, 8 to 14 days, so that's in that 1 to 2 weeks from now, we really see, you know, that colder pattern kind of setting over the northern Rockies down to the southern plains, including much of South Dakota, and also drier pattern with that as well. So, you know, it's not really great news as we end March. This would be for the last week of March. You know, the deeper we get into spring and keep losing our moisture chances, the tougher it is to kind of get out of the hole, so to speak, of our moisture deficit this season. This time of year, we're starting to ramp up our climatology. I think March is 1.5 to maybe 1 3/4 inches of moisture for much of eastern South Dakota. You know, as we get into April, we're pushing 2 to 3 into May. And June is about 3 1/3, 3.5. So, you know, we really need this rainfall here to come the spring season. April outlook. This is what came out yesterday. Looking at the month ahead, you see almost all of the lower 48 states there leaning towards the orange side. That's warmer than average. I'd say there's pretty high confidence in the temperature outlook for April, spring, you know, through the spring and summer. The climate models, the computer models are really narrowing in and coming to consensus on the temperature side. I'd say it's pretty high confidence in that. Moisture side, on the right there, precipitation for April, you know, we're kind of on the fringe of what looks like to be a drier area over the Intermountain West and Rockies. So, you know, the southwest corner of the state right now has odds slightly leaning towards dry, not really high probability. But again, in this April season, moisture is going to be critical for our winter wheat, reducing our fire risk, and just getting our soils primed up for planting. April through June, April, May, June, all put together, that 3-month period looks very similar to the April pattern I just showed you. Again, warmth over much of the lower 48, and very similar southwest corner of the state, kind of clipped towards drier in that area. So, but you see that they have some very dark brown there over the Intermountain West and Central Rockies there. That's pretty high confidence, I'd say, for a spring outlook. Spring is a real challenging season where you see a lot of ups and downs as you transition from more of a winter pattern to more of like a summer pattern. So that they're actually being pretty bold, I'd say, in their outlook here with the deep colors on their probability of dry and the wet side too over the Great Lakes. June, this is where the kind of rubber meets the road. June, July, August, the middle of the summer. And I think this is something to think about, something to prepare for. And, you know, very much, as I said, you know, very high confidence in the temperature outlook with warmth all the way across the country for the summer season. That alone is tough. Even if we had near normal moisture, having warmer temperatures just saps that moisture. The evaporative demand gets really high. So that's going to be a challenge in and of itself, I'd say right there. But then you look on the right side, combine that with the outlook favored to be drier, really centered over the north central, northwest states. You know, it's not the news we wanted to hear. This is a bit of a change. This is a bit of a change from the last month's update. So that's what I wanted to really make you guys aware of, like whatever drought situation we carry through this spring, and I think we will have some. I mean, we have a deep hole here to get out of. So, you know, be a little bit ready here for what that might mean for the summer. I think, you know, row crops could get planted in pretty easily, but they might be challenged in that midsummer season with lack of moisture and heat. Grasses, forages, those kinds of things, you know, carrying over dry conditions from last fall is the first part. But if we don't get good moisture this spring, I think that's a double whammy. And with heat too, we can see those grasses cure out a little earlier as well with dry and heat. So again, thinking of this in mind as you're making your grazing plan, your water plan. I know we don't have a lot of irrigation here, but those of you who do, you know, I think that's something to be prepared for as well. And then the seasonal drought outlook that was also released yesterday. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the drought monitor and then the outlooks that I just showed you. This is valid through the end of June. And I know that the last drought monitor just removed some drought there in southern South Dakota, but again, given what I just showed you, they're projecting that D1 or worse could come back to southern South Dakota and neighboring Nebraska by the end of June. So they're not real optimistic at this point that the drought's going to stay away for the rest of the spring, that it might come back. You know, it's natural too, if you watch the drought monitor, it's natural to see ups and downs throughout the season, especially the spring season, as soil thaws out and we see impacts kind of a little more rapidly responding to either wet or dry. So I'd expect some ups and downs in the drought monitor, but the drought outlook shows overall by the end of June, we could see an increase in drought area there in the south. In the eastern part of the state, a little less certain there, at least in the spring season for precipitation. So a couple of take-home messages as I wrap up here in the last minute or so. You know, all that drought talk means pretty favorable planting conditions, right? Like you won't have any issue getting in there. We have, you know, virtually no prevent plant, no flooding to really speak of. So at least you can get seed in the ground. Think about your nutrient management, your fertilizer maybe might be one thing to think about there. Warmer than average favored in the spring and summer. One thing with that too that we've seen in previous droughts, say 2017 for example, we've seen really late frosts with very dry air. It can heat and cool very quickly. I believe it was 2017, third week in June, we saw temperatures dip to freezing up in the north central part of the state, say Gettysburg and north of there. Not to say you should plan around that. There's nothing really you can do about it, but just an awareness that we can see some dramatic temperature swings there. Precipitation outlook, again, a little less certain in eastern South Dakota, at least April, May, June. But as we look later into the summer, we are setting up for a drier pattern over the north central states here. And as I said earlier, you know, we don't have that bank account of soil moisture to rely on to carry us through this growing season like we did last year. So anything you can do to save your soil moisture, what you have right now, I think is favorable to your benefit. With that, I just wanted to share two quick things here that aren't really Outlook related, but I wanted to remind folks or tell you we have a spray tool here with a Mesonet that is really designed for pesticide applicators. We have inversion data, boom height, wind speed for those of you who are doing dicamba applications over the top in soybeans. And various other measurements and variables that you need for your weather record keeping for your pesticide records. So you can look at a map like this. This was a boom height wind speed map I snapped a couple days ago. Also, we have, you can look at each station as well and see if there's an inversion, what your delta T is, wind speed, direction, all this other stuff. So I encourage you to use that. If you guys are out there, either commercial or private applicators, you can use this for your official record keeping. The Department of Ag will accept Mesonet data for your official record keeping if there's one near you. So I encourage you at least to check it out. It's updated every 5 minutes, so about as real time as you can get right there. And then we have March Madness recruiting for COCORAWs, our community collaborative rain, hail, and snow network, a group of volunteers that measure rain, snow, hail all throughout the year. You can report it on a smartphone or on the computer online. And it's a great way too for you to keep track of what precipitation you have at your farm, in your backyard, wherever the case may be. I've been reporting for a long time, and it's really kind of fun to go back and see my records per year and if there's different events that occurred and that kind of thing. It's our big March Madness recruiting month right now, and I know I haven't pushed this too hard, but if you're interested in signing up to be a volunteer, it doesn't cost anything to register. You just need a rain gauge. And I do have some rain gauges here in the office. So if you're super excited and you want to sign up and you just need a rain gauge, I think I can connect you with one. So feel free to reach out to me with that. Lastly, here's my email, phone number, and so on. And that's what I've got for you today. Sorry, I went really fast that. Dave, I can pass it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. If anybody has any questions for Laura, go ahead and use the Q&A feature, and she will answer to the best of her ability. Okay, and next we have Kevin Lau, who is a hydrologist with the National Weather Service at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center in Pleasantville, Missouri. And Kevin's going to provide a spring flood potential brief for the Missouri River Basin. And with that, Kevin.
All righty, thank you, Dave. All righty, Dave, can you see my screen? Dave?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, I can.
Okay, all righty, very good. All righty, well, good morning, everyone. As Dave said, I'm Kevin Lau. I'm a hydrologist with the National Weather Service. Our office is in Kansas City, or close to Kansas City. And our responsibility is surface water prediction within the entire Missouri Basin, of which, of course, South Dakota, all but 3 or 4 counties in the extreme northeast, of course, is in the Missouri Basin. So my talk will be more basin-wide than just South Dakota, so I hope that's all right. So as Laura said, during conditions like we have now, I'm probably the only person that's truly happy, and that's because flood risk across almost the entire basin is reduced this spring as compared to normal. Each month, our office issues a long-range 3-month river outlook. In fact, we issue them even more often in the months of February and March as we lead up to spring flooding. And these long-range outlooks attempt to determine the probability of reaching flood stage at any one of the nearly 500 locations that we monitor across the basin. And so I say that flood risk for this spring is reduced from normal, and I'm hoping that this graphic will sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. So the right-hand graphic is the most recent official probabilistic outlook for the next 3 months for the Missouri River at Leavenworth, Kansas. That's just upstream of Kansas City. This run was made on March 8th, and it is valid for the 3-month period mid-March through mid-June. And we do this for all 500 locations across the basin, but I chose the Missouri at Leavenworth to illustrate just how reduced the flood risk is for most of our basin. And so this graphic, I hope, serves as an example of the departure or the gap between historical, which is the blue line, and today's condition, which is the black line. So what this right-hand graphic is showing is that conditions on the ground, at least conditions on the ground in early March, resulted in an overall decrease in the chance to reach flood stage here at Leavenworth of 24%. That's valid over the next 3 months. So normally Leavenworth would have about a 52% chance of hitting flood stage this time of year. But because of conditions on the ground, the lack of plain snow, dry soils, and so forth, it only has a 28% chance of hitting flood stage this year. And the map on the left-hand side, Leavenworth would show up as a teal color, a teal dot. And the colors on that map on the left-hand side show the departure by color of all the locations within the basin. And so you can find on that left-hand map locations throughout the basin that have anywhere from 10 to as much as a 50% reduction in flooding potential. Now, there are a handful of locations, such as the little orange dots that you see there in the central part of the state of Missouri, that have anywhere from 30 to a 50% increase in flood potential for this spring. So the blanket statement that that there's a reduced flood risk for the basin, it doesn't cover each and every location, but it is the general trend. So that's why throughout this spring, when I've been doing briefings like this one, we've been categorizing flood risk as below normal for the basin. Now, as you all know, and as Laura mentioned, we had quite a little bit of rain over the past 7 days. So I took the liberty on the right-hand side here to pull some preliminary data. So this isn't our official outlook. Our official outlook is still the left-hand side, where the chance for reaching flood stage has been reduced 24%. But because of all the rains that we received in Nebraska, I think the entire state of Nebraska had something on the order of 2 to 3 inches over the whole state. And in the eastern portion, there were large pockets, widespread pockets of 4 to 6 inches. And so that rain has effectively reduced, if you will, the decrease. And so on the right-hand side, you see what our likelihood of flooding is at Leavenworth now, given last week's rain. Basically, what it's done is it's put it right back. It's put our conditional simulation all the way back up to historical. So basically, the rains of the past week have resulted in Leavenworth now being about a 50-50 chance of hitting flood stage over the next 3 months. Now, not all locations had this much of a increase in flood risk. For most of the state of Missouri, it has not been in the drought conditions that most of the basin has been in. So soils in the state of Missouri have been fairly normal, if you will, for the past, for the winter. And so the rains that we received this past week actually did not increase the chance for flooding, not appreciably, because in the state of Missouri, those locations already had pretty much a normal risk. So this dramatic decrease, if you will, in the decrease of chance for flooding didn't happen everywhere. But I thought that you'd be interested in seeing this as an example. So as I expand out and talk about flood potential for the basin, we have to start in the mountains, because the mountains drive much of the runoff, of course, in the Missouri Basin. And so this graphic, courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or the NRCS, as most of us know it as, it shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of average snow water equivalent. That's the amount of liquid held in the snowpack. Mountain snowpack ranges from watershed to watershed, as you can see, but overall, we're calling the mountainous snowpack as being near average for this time of year. And we are about 85% through the snow accumulating season in the mountains, maybe even closer to 90%. And so things could still change a little bit, but the contributions of mountain snowpack melt to the basin's runoff is coming into focus. Now, I will say that the system that brought the heavy rains to Nebraska also brought snows to Colorado and to Wyoming. And so if I'd have showed this graphic a week ago, North Platte and South Platte basins, they're in the lower portion, those would have been around 70 to 80%. So we gained more than 10% of the average snowpack for the Platte system as a whole. So we were saying a week ago that the Platte system was below normal with respect to mountain snowpack, but last weekend's massive snowstorm brought the North and South Platte mountains overall snowpack to normal or near normal. Speaking of the contribution from the snow melt that we expect, even though we have a near normal mountain snowpack now, we are still calling for below normal runoff volumes, and that's because of the dry conditions. And so the numbers that you see there, we do a water supply forecast that extends from April to September, that the volume that we expect from April to September as compared to average. Those are the percentages that we believe we will see this coming year. And so just like the NRCS, they also do water supply forecasts. Well, we do as well, not to compete with them, but we also produce a water supply forecast. Now, I will say that these numbers are from a week ago, and I looked this morning, and our North Platte and South Platte averages would increase about 10 to 15%. So North Platte, I believe, is up to, let's see, North Platte is up to 66%, up from that 59, and South Platte is up to 77%, up from the 61. And we are not expecting significant flooding from mountain snowpack alone. It would take a rain on snow event to have flooding in the mountains this year. Looking at the plains, the recent system did provide a fresh snowpack extending from Colorado up through South Dakota. Prior to this, the basin was pretty much devoid of plain snowpack. However, this, even though we have gained some nice amounts, especially in southeast Wyoming, we do not think that this plain snowpack will appreciably increase flood risk for those areas. So talking about flood risk, prior to last week's rain, flood risk, and we state that a location, we'll say that a location is likely to see flooding if it has better than a 50% chance of reaching a certain flood magnitude. And so you can see here that based on the outlook that we ran a couple of weeks ago, we would see 15 gauges going into moderate flooding. We would see 33 gauges going into minor. And the concentration would all be in the lowest portion of the basin, eastern Kansas and the state of Missouri. And in fact, we did have flooding. With the rains of this past week, we did have minor to moderate flooding in both eastern Kansas as well as the state of Missouri. But given last week's rain, now our next outlook that we'll be issuing next week, I think it is, the area that we believe will have at least minor level flooding will expand northward into southeast Nebraska and southwestern Iowa. Now looking just at the Missouri main stem itself below Gavin's Point, 2 weeks ago, we were outlooking minor flooding below Kansas City. But with the rains that we've received, our next outlook will likely say that we project minor flooding south of Nebraska City. And in fact, right now, with the rains of last week, the river below Kansas City has experienced minor flooding, and there is a crest moving through the lower system, and several locations from Waverly, Missouri down to the mouth is expected to go above minor flood stage. Also, the chances for moderate level flooding, which is a little bit more severe, those will probably be in our next outlook as well for locations downstream of Kansas City. But all of this is rather typical. Minor to moderate flooding along the lower reaches of the Missouri River is typical. And so, in summary then, flood risk overall for the Missouri Basin is lower than normal for spring of 2021. Mountain snowpack is near average. We still have roughly 15% of the snow accumulating period remaining. There is some new plain snowpack, but the risk, the chances of increased flood risk due to that new plain snowpack is negligible. The latest Drought Monitor puts 85% of the Missouri Basin in abnormally dry conditions or worse. That is an improvement over the last one. The last one had 90%. So the rains have helped that a little bit. Northern soils, as Laura had mentioned, we still have frost, but we believe that they remain porous. And so frozen ground conditions limited to North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, we don't believe will have an exacerbating effect on the runoff production. I didn't mention river ice conditions, and that's because river ice concerns are rapidly diminishing. We do have ice still in rivers in Montana and Wyoming and in the Dakotas. The last reports I saw, which are kind of old, they're probably 2 weeks old, I saw ice thicknesses of 1 to 2 feet. But given the absence of an appreciable plain snowpack, very dry soils, and low stream flows going into freeze up, the risk for river ice breakup jamming is greatly diminished from normal. Thunderstorm activity drives the flooding in the lower basin. And so we are expecting episodic minor to moderate level flooding in southeast Nebraska, western Iowa, eastern Kansas, and across the state of Missouri, just like we're experiencing this week. And so I think with that, I did look at a few specific rivers in South Dakota as far as the reduction in flood risk. The James River has about a 20% reduction in flood risk this year. The Belle Fourche is about 10% less. The Cheyenne is about 10% less. Just a few examples of flood risk reduction due to current conditions. So no one likes drought, but those of us who work at the River Forecast Center. So it does help us in our job. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Dave.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Does anybody have questions for Kevin?
I have a question for Kevin. I could take the
Yeah.
privilege. So you mentioned 20% reduction in flood risk. That's as compared to average in the James River Basin. Is that
Right.
correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So given current conditions that we're looking at now, what kind it looks like most of our, if we get flooding, then it'd be more thunderstorm driven, if
Yes.
anything.
Right.
And
Right.
and so any idea like how much rain over what period of time could cause say a flooding situation, you know, like 2 inches over an hour, that's probably low, but you know, 5 inches over a day. Do you have any idea what kind of rain event it would take to get to a flood stage?
That's an excellent question, Laura, and I don't have a good answer for you. Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, when I say a 20% reduction, when I look at the probabilities for the James, it's not like we're expecting the James to flood. For instance, James River at Stratford, that's the one that stayed up for so long. Historically, it has about a 47% chance of flooding over the next 3 months. But this year, we're saying a 13% chance. So when I say a reduction, it's not just that we still expect it to flood. There's like Zippo chance. So that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you as far as, you know, would it take 5 inches? You know, I was really surprised last week with the Platte River in eastern Nebraska. You know, we had, you know, probably on average 4 inches across the entire lower Platte and Elkhorn. And it did not flood. And that, if you'd have told me that we would have got that much rain, in fact, we did put out flood forecasts for it all through the event last week, at least the early part. We were sure that Platte River at North Bend, at LaShara, at Louisville would flood, but it didn't. So, you know, I would say you could get that much rain over the James and it wouldn't do that. So.
Yeah, it's quite a change of pace from what we're used to seeing. Yeah, Stratford's one of the first gauges to go up and one of the last to come down. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We do have a question in the Q&A that I can address while you're figuring that out.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and go back in.
Yeah. Someone asked, how much rainfall is needed to break the drought? So that's a tough question. It depends over what period of time, you know, again. But I have seen some numbers say twice the expected, or twice the average rainfall in the next 3 months to come out of the drought. I know NOAA has some data together that you can get under drought amelioration. But I didn't draw those numbers, but I think we need quite a bit more than average. And then again, like I said, the temperature side, you know, it's looking warmer than average, so we need even a little more moisture to make up for the heat, potentially, especially as you get into summer, where the evaporative demand can get really high.
How about now, Laura? Do you see it?
Yep, we see that
now. All right.
Oh, Laura and Dave, I failed to mention that NOAA did issue its 2021 U.S. Spring Outlook yesterday, and I sent Laura the link. I should have put it in the slides, but I didn't. But folks may want to, and that covers the entire United States.
Yeah, I did, Kevin. I did see that. I put it in the chat, so I think everyone should be able to see that there. Yep.
Okay, so what you see up on your screen is for next week. So you're welcome to join us for next week too. That'll be our last week, week 12 of crop hour. So
Yeah, and just a note, next week on the 26th is actually the private applicator recertification day, so that's a 3-hour session. So a little bit different than the normal 1 hour we've been doing.
There have been some questions about registration for that, and essentially you just register for the crop hour session, and then that will give you the link for the entire week, each day of the week, and you will just, if that's all you're interested in, for example, you would just tune in on the 26th for that session. But like Laura mentioned, it is 3 hours, but the registration is just simply through our website.
Any other questions for Laura or Kevin before we wrap things up and go to our informal conversation? Having seen none right now, you're more than welcome to stick around for an informal conversation, or otherwise you can call her a day here and go on with the rest of your day. And I wish you a good weekend, and hopefully we get some more precip here soon. So.